Good viewer, you are watching Xirtus. This is because Xirtus makes you feel good, makes you feel fulfilled. You are enjoying this. You will continue to watch Xirtus for a long time to come. You want to subscribe to Xirtus, and you will. You will like and subscribe and share. You will tell your friends. Tell your friends about Xirtus. Your friends will come to like Xirtus, much as you are liking this right now, as we speak. Thank you for subscribing to Xirtus. See, that was easy.
Hello. Welcome to the Xirtus.
Well, I was all excited because Chloe's joining us, and I was really excited. And then I went, and I was like going to pull up her links, and I was like, "Look, Chloe, how cool is Chloe? Chloe's great." And then I was going to go to her Wikipedia page, and I saw this, and I saw that there's no apostrophe over my E in the name. I failed you, Chloe. I'm really sorry. So everyone should know that there should be an apostrophe. It's Chloe with an apostrophe on the E. However, since you didn't do it on the YouTube, I don't feel nearly as bad now, so that's okay. How are you?
Yeah, it's okay. I'm well. It's actually my fault that the apostrophe or the accent is no, because I typed in my name when I joined the link and I didn't actually do it. So you shouldn't feel bad at all. It was totally my fault.
I would totally, or we could blame France, you know, like realistically. Really want to
Yes.
How far back you want to go. So maybe, also David and Thomas are joining us. This is Synctank. Good to see you guys. How's it been?
Good. I think you should blame San Andreas.
Yeah,
the fault, if we're gonna establish fault.
I just use the American alphabet. We don't need silly little symbols on top of our letters. Like we've evolved beyond that.
Like the apostrophe belongs to the E. Like it's the E's apostrophe. Okay, it's like a possessive apostrophe.
Well, you know, I'm from Louisiana, and we still retain our French heritage. We still run on Napoleonic law. So somehow we snuck in there. Somehow we snuck into American psyche. Somehow we're still here. So I got to rep it. So it's still my fault.
Actually, something I find really interesting. I was in Louisiana around Christmas, and it's crazy how different the culture is because of Napoleonic law. Because the way you think about what you're going to do is completely affected. Like, if it's a law or if it's not a law, and like, well, how's the governor feeling right now? Kind of a vibe, you know. If the governor's into it, then it's a law. If he's not into it, everybody's doing it.
If you had to pick between Creole and French Canadian, like where are you going? Right? It's like Louisiana 10 times out of 10.
I feel like you could do either one if you had to.
It's the humidity.
Well,
or cold. So
you know what's interesting? I dropped recently, as I often do, that the birthplace of jazz is New Orleans. But my friend who's from Canada was like, "No, it's not. People say this all the time, and it's actually come from an amalgamation of places." And I was literally like, I don't care. Like, as far as I am concerned, because I think he was probably trying to articulate that because of the Canadian influence down into Louisiana, like it didn't just come from New Orleans. And it's just like you're being a technical jackass. Like that's not the point. New Orleans is the birthplace of jazz, and I will die on that hill.
Yeah, I know. I think it's also harder for people to understand what Louisiana is versus what it was, because half of America was Louisiana. So Louisiana can just kind of can take claim to anything it really kind of wants to, right? Like Louisiana has the best West Coast surf if it really felt like it. Like it could be.
Yeah.
We got
I forgot
here
that it was
too,
half.
Because what's his name? John Fogerty. Like he was born on a bayou, but there's bayous out here apparently. Because I don't know how else to explain that.
Yeah, sure.
Wait, David, where are you calling from?
Andreas and I are calling from Santa Cruz.
Yeah, California.
Oh, okay.
He's about maybe, I don't know what, 20 miles away from me, something like that.
Doesn't his room kind of look like it belongs in New Orleans though? Like,
yes, that's very confusing.
Where are you calling from?
Yeah, that's funny.
Well, I want to.
Can you tell what city I'm in based on my background?
Yeah, good point.
No, I mean I could guess, but literally no.
Yeah.
Honestly,
let's start with this. Which side of the country is he on? Which side of the country? Or is he in the middle?
He's in the middle.
I'll give you a hint. I did smoke bath salt 15 minutes ago. That gives you any hint as to what state I'm in.
I don't know that reference. Like
really?
I have no
Did you say your state of mind? Or are you talking about where you're at?
It was Flacco.
I'm in Orlando. I'm in Orlando.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
They give you a pack of bath salts as you come into the state. As you cross over the state line, they like throw it at you.
Wait, so I was actually looking at your background and I was reminded of that music video where that guy who like sung a famous song that went viral that was like really resonant with a lot of working class folks.
Oh,
do you know the song I'm talking about?
I
do.
Video?
I know what song you're talking about. You're talking about the ginger, right?
Sunday, but no, I think it's the guy with the banjo in the woods.
Yeah.
Yeah. He ended up like falling out of favor. He immediately went and like chugged like a 6-pack of Bud Light and like took money from some corporation, and people hated him like within 24 hours.
Well, people need to remember Appalachians control the media. That's the thing.
Well, the only information I know is that the RNC tried to sort of like use him as a kind of representative, and he was like, I don't you're the guys I'm talking about. You're the guys I'm critiquing in my song. So, and ever since then, that's when I remember not hearing anything from him. But I don't actually know what happened to him.
That's what I've gotten from Greta Thunberg, is that she was just
spill the tea.
She had so much intention, and you know, her parents are activists, so she's obviously influenced that way. But I talked to people in Stockholm, and I talked to a lot of people about it, and they would just be like, we saw her all the time by herself, standing there with a sign, doing her thing, and they'd drive past her and they'd be like, that little girl. And so for them to see her on television, it's like, wow, she's doing it. She made it. She did the thing. And also, if you talk to any of them, the question of like, do you think maybe she's being exploited? They're like, yeah,
of course.
No question. So it's like, it's kind of this duplicit thing where they're like, they're both happy for her. And then they're also like, yeah, she's.
Isn't more like Jaw?
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if that's curious that she was alone though, that they saw her all the time alone. Because I wonder if that's
she wasn't always alone,
wonder if
but she spent a lot of time alone. So, yeah.
Well, just parents.
I wonder if she's an introvert, because I have historically been an introvert, although that's sort of changing in me. I'm kind of like forcing myself not to be an introvert, but as an introvert historically, I could get inside my head a lot, and that can feel a kind of activism that's actually like that's totally divorced from reality, in the sense that like if I'm not actually in community with people and my quote unquote activism isn't informed by being in community with people, it can be abstract. And I wonder if she deals with any of that, or if that is like present in how she shows up in any way, shape, or form. So it's curious that
I feel like it's a little bit harder. What you described there, I would oversimplify in my American brain as like white knighting in a way, where it's like you're like being offended and therefore defending on behalf of someone else that might not even that much oblivious to it. But I almost feel like climate change, if you really buy into the concept of climate change, that's something you don't really have to white knight for, because you can care about the environment without like being exploited at the most superficial level, obviously, with like a million asterisks here.
Yeah,
there is something about that though, like a kind of like not quite Stockholm syndrome, where you're told as a kid that you're you know, who are we? Oh, we're the best. We take care of the world, right? You know, and what do you have to deal with? Oh, there's so many problems in the world, and
yeah,
it's gonna be gone if you don't do anything. You have to do something, and I feel like that's something people don't realize. They did this a lot to American kids in the 90s too. They're like, you can do anything, you can become whatever you want, but it's really kind of inferring like you should go off and do something in there. You should become the best cog in their system possible. Right? I feel like she feels like eventually has to.
So I have two things to say in response to this. One is, because I grew up in a religious home, I grew up with that dynamic. Like, I grew up in a very esoteric. I mean, I think every religion thinks of itself as special, but I grew up in a very esoteric iteration where it was like, we are the real Christians, and all the other Christians are not fake, but like, because that wasn't a term that was used, but all the other Christians aren't doing Christianity correctly, and you have to do it correctly in order to, so you're both alone because most people aren't doing it the way you're doing it. So you develop a kind of martyr complex actually around that. But then you take pride. You take pride. Yes. Oh my
God. Sinful, like order yourself up. The International Continental God.
You're doing deep in the research. Wow, I haven't seen this logo.
We're saying except for Roman Catholics, because Roman Catholics have it right.
I have a few friends who are.
I grew up in a very anti-Catholic house, so that's funny. That's funny.
Well, you know, you're just trying to make sure that the Great Abominable Church doesn't like take away our chance at the reestablishment. I get it. I get what you're after.
Is this an offshoot of the Plymouth Brethren? Crowley's.
Not that I'm aware of.
No, I'm joking. But just that idea that everyone else is going to hell.
You guys gotta slow down your references, because sometimes I'm not gonna get them.
Oh no, it's just it was
just assume it's about a cult, a serial killer, or some combination of the two. You know.
What Netflix miniseries does your religion have?
The Gunnar Armstrong Evangelistic Association. Still going strong.
Who is my boy here? Maybe tell us a little background about what this is, like, because you made it sound.
So yeah.
The guitar does tell it.
This church was established by Herbert W. Armstrong. I want to say in the 50s and 60s. I'm not exactly sure. It was taken up by his son, Garner Ted Armstrong. And Tyler, Texas was the headquarters, but there were different churches around the country. I think primarily in the South, actually. One of which was established in New Orleans. My father used to be a Baptist, and he was reading the Old Testament one day, and he was like, actually, we should be going to church on Saturday instead of Sunday, and we should be observing all of the holy days in the book of Leviticus. And why aren't we doing that? And then he went to his Baptist preacher, who promptly or subsequently ignored him. So he ended up searching for a church that showed up in that way, and this is the church that he found, the Intercontinental Church of God. So I attended that church throughout my entire childhood up until I was like 21. So I grew up going to church on Saturday instead of Sunday. I grew up in a very multiracial church, so there's always like the category that was the most important category in my family growing up was religion. Religion transcended everything else, including race, which has definitely shaped like how I've come to the opinions that I've come to today. But yeah, it was a very, what I fondly now refer to as a psychedelic experience.
Wow. How so? Like why the word psychedelic out of all the plethora of words that we could use?
He's a fan of that one.
Yeah. Okay. I do. No. They were. It was psychedelic in the sense that it was mind bending. So I do psychedelics now. Like I microdose on psilocybin regularly, and I believe in the power of psychedelics to transform the psyche. But I would describe it. The reason why I describe it as psychedelic is because I grew up in a Catholic town, attending an anti-Catholic church that observed Jewish holidays. So my sense of insider, outsider, like my identity was always insider, outsider. I was never fully in a mainstream Christian framework. I was never fully in a mainstream New Orleans framework. I was never fully in a mainstream Jewish framework. It was always inside and outside. If you think of acid or LSD, if you think of shrooms, both of these substances, at least I have taken them, have revealed to me the constantly birthing and dying nature of reality itself. So if you were to interpret that inside outsider is always coming in and always coming out, always coming in and always coming out, that's what I mean by psychedelic.
Like the walls are breathing, the religious version.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, so there's a couple of interesting things about the ICG. One of them being that it's basically kind of an Arianist belief of non-Trinitarian, right? They kind of disavow the Trinity. Isn't that like a thing?
Well, I don't know what you mean by Arian, but they're definitely not into they're not into the Trinity. They're not into any of the mainstream Christian holidays, which perceive as pagan. So they're not into paganism. Oh, okay. This is
Arius. Yeah, not the Arians, but Arius, who had his own sect of Arians, because they consider themselves like Arius. He was an anti-Trinitarian, and they've burned a lot of his works. The Catholic Church actually has their whole creed. Basically, every Sunday they say, like, we affirm the Trinity and all stuff. It's all because they poisoned this guy, and he died like vomiting and excreting blood, right? Because they poisoned Arius.
Interesting. This is the first time I'm hearing about this.
Yeah, there's actually pretty gnarly pictures of him like bleeding and like dying like of dysentery at the end when they poisoned him to death. But some people call him a saint, right? Saint Arius, and a lot of groups like the Seventh-day Adventists, Mormon, like different groups are more into Arius than the Catholics. The Catholics think he's like evil, you know. There's a picture of Santa Claus.
I admit that the Catholics are efficient, because I still like the concept of the Trinity, and I never even heard of this dude that they killed. So like, you can't argue with results.
It works.
In certain context.
Yeah, but
wait. Is this, Andreas? Is this the Mormon agenda? Like, did you choose to have this particular guest because you had researched her background and saw this Mormon connection? And
he's going to chip out the Trinity first, and the rest of it's going to be just Mormonism all the way down.
I was really trying to find that video. There's a great video of this like little Irishman. He's like trying to explain, no, Patrick, that's not the Trinity. That's modalism. No, Patrick. That's the thing. Like, I don't think. Yeah, here, hold on. Actually, let me just pull this up for a second. This is the problem with the Trinity. If you can describe the Trinity, you can't.
But remember that we're simple people without your fancy education and books and learning, and we're hearing about all of this for the first time. So try to keep it simple, okay, Patrick? Yeah, real simple, Patrick.
Sure, there are three persons of the Trinity: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Yet there is only one God.
Don't get what you're saying here, Patrick. Not picking up what you're laying down here, Patrick. Use an analogy, Patrick.
Sure. The Trinity is like water, and how you can find water in three different forms: liquid and ice and vapor.
That's modalism, Patrick. What? Modalism, an ancient heresy confessed by teachers such as Noetus and Sibelius, which espouses that God is not three distinct persons, but that he merely reveals himself in three different forms. This heresy was clearly condemned in Canon 1 at the First Council of Constantinople in 381 AD, and those who confess it cannot rightly be considered a part of the Church Catholic. Come on, Patrick. Get it together, Patrick.
Okay, then the Trinity is like the sun in the sky, where you have the star and the light and the heat.
Oh, Patrick. Come on, Patrick. That's Arianism, Patrick.
Arianism?
Yes, Arianism, Patrick. A theology which states that Christ and the Holy Spirit are creations of the Father and not one in nature with him. Exactly like how heat and light are not the star itself, but are merely creations of the star. That's a bad analogy, Patrick. You're the worst, Patrick.
All right, sorry. The Trinity is like this three-leaf clover here.
I'm going to stop you right there, Patrick. Yeah, hold your horses, Patrick. You're about to confess partialism.
Partialism?
Yes, partialism, a heresy which asserts that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are not distinct persons of the Godhead, but are different parts of God, each composing 1/3 of the divine.
And who confesses the heresy of partialism?
The first season of the cartoon program Voltron, where 5 robot lion cars merge together to form one giant robot samurai, obviously.
I've never heard of Voltron.
All right, there's a lot of basically the rule is you can't talk about the Trinity. You can't talk about the Trinity for more than a minute, or else you'll be excommunicated, and never write anything down.
That's my question. Like, how do you find these? Where do you find these? Like,
this is Andreas. He's a master.
The internet is undefeated, and apparently underrated, and I didn't know that was possible.
I guarantee you that you've seen Andreas's memes and not known that it was Andreas's memes, because he puts them out into the world. There's no watermark. It's just they just exist and they're out there. So
I just feel like someday with a longitudinal study with AI, they'll be able to figure out which memes were mine. It'll all work out.
A cross-reference everything.
Emoji analysis. But I mean, the thing about the Trinity is weird, because people like this is when people think about Westernism and Western religion, it's tied to monotheism, but monotheism through the nuance of the Trinitarian model. And the Trinitarian model, how popular is it? Well, the elite, you go to the Unitarian or the Trinitarians of Harvard and Yale, right? So there's something, I mean, something about the Trinitarians that are centric to control. And it's interesting that a lot of groups will say, oh, the Catholic Church, they've pushed this idea of the Trinity, which we can't really describe. Like, I don't think even after all that, we know how to describe really what the Trinity means. It's just sort of this map, right? So I don't know if you have thoughts on that. Like, do you think of God as a separate entity, or what, like, you know?
My framework is pretty Zen Buddhist now. So I'm neither a theist nor an atheist, or although I do have theist, you know, like bad theism inevitably. Yeah, exactly. Theist inclinations because of how I grew up, which was very theistic. But now I am pretty non-theistic in the sense that there's this Zen Buddhist teachings, specifically within the Japanese Zen tradition, of the no-thingness of God. Like, God is no thing. So there's nothing that you can. I mean, I thought what's his name was super into this famous Jewish philosopher from Amsterdam whose name is escaping me. Anyone?
Jewish philosopher. David?
Spinoza, maybe?
Yes, Spinoza.
Oh, sweet.
Okay, so
next time, give me a decade or a century next time. I was really
wow.
Spinoza was super into this. This idea that, like, you can't. There is nothing that you could say to describe God. There's no concept. There's no language. There's no concept. There's no thing that can capture God. And so in Japanese Zen Buddhism, they often speak of the no-thingness of God, or the no-thingness beyond God, from which all things emanate. So I believe in that. That's essentially my ironic conclusion.
You know,
and what is?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No, you go.
Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
I was just going to say what emerges out of that in terms of lifestyle is I want to live a lifestyle of ritual. So I want a lifestyle of where I'm like in touch with the constantly changing nature of all things. This is related to psychedelics, right? So like I am a new bird watcher. I love watching the birds. And if you watch the birds, you notice, or I started to notice, that they always seem to be flying in a circular motion. They're never like flying straight at their target. They're flying circularly towards their target. I also play capoeira, and capoeira is this Brazilian martial art that came from slaves in West Africa when it came to Brazil. And there's a lot of circular motion in capoeira. And the idea behind that is that you never force anything in capoeira. You move with your opponent. So if your opponent is like kicking to the right, you defend to the right. If your opponent is kicking to the left, you defend to the left. And there's something very ritualistic and sacred and beautiful about like being at one with the unfolding nature of all things. And that's how I try to live my life.
Yeah, you yield to overcome. So, you know,
I was gonna say, like, kung fu movie, there really needs to be like a Brazilian capoeira superhero movie.
Well, it's a way to teach a martial art to people and do it in such a way that it's dance at the same time.
Yeah,
It's like
exactly.
it's more cover. I think that's like a wrong evaluation from what I gather. Like it's like that's an aspect of the thing, and that's the way it is. I think people sometimes treat it that it's like, oh, we're gonna subliminally, it's more like, wax on, wax off,
There's a Trinitarian analogy in here, man. I swear to you, between dancing and capoeira.
Well, say more. What is it? What is it?
Well, just like they're not the same thing, but they are emanations of a.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you can't have the fighting without the dancing.
I can hear that.
So
I can hear that.
Right. So
Elon,
go ahead. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Elon Musk.
I was going to say, Elon Musk was interviewed by Mormons recently, and they asked him what he believed about God, and he said, he quoted Einstein, where Einstein had said to Rabbi Goldstein, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the harmonies of all that exists, not in a God that concerns himself with the fate and the doings of mankind." Right?
Well, he's a realist, and so the realists, they don't necessarily like what they treat as the Elohim, like those are like beings, but they're not necessarily like, that's not the Godhead, so they still have a treatment of that. I don't know. I'm no expert on realism, but I know that that's his bag.
You can go deep into Kabbalah, though. I know also that Elon Musk went to a Hebrew preschool, right? So his like earliest foundational memories are like in numerology and like I wouldn't say Kabbalah, but a little bit. Right.
Well, yeah, if he was learning the alphabet at all, and then he's learning numbers at the same time because there's one system for them. That's interesting. I didn't know that about him.
Yeah.
So Kabbalistically, like if you're doing it, like Kabbalists will get accused by some of being atheist because they have a treatment of kind of like what you're saying. Like if it stands out in space in any way, then it can't be the source. So they have this emphasis in Jewish mysticism around the principle of emanation, the way things go from etheric to gross and stand out in space. So, and that includes like even in the mind. So they say anything that's molded by the hand or the mind, that can't be that. And that relates then to the temple and that it can't be built by human hands and these kind of ideas, but we do it anyway because that's just what we do, kind of like with the tree in the first place. Like all these trees are cool, all the, everything, go to town, but don't do this one thing. And then what do? That's what we do. It's something about human nature, but they'll get accused of atheism in that way because of Ein Sof, but then they'll also get accused of being, having all these different gods because people look at what are the Sephirot, which when you describe the Trinity, that's immediately where my mind goes. I'm thinking of Keter, Chochmah, and Bina, the supernal triad of the Kabbalistic tree. And so like, and even beyond like medieval depictions, just like what that is in nature. And so like we're talking about nature and everything stands out in nature. And then, so you're like, in a sense, you have that is also God because something can't come from nothing. And so like, if you're talking about the geometries of things and you're getting into like the Trinity, like I can dig that if you're applying it to like this level of the emanation in dense physical space, but then like, so, and it's also yoga, like you were saying Zen Buddhism, it's the same thing. They say in Zen Buddhism that what makes the Buddha is that at the time of death, or who knows when you see that light, it's like everybody goes into the light. Everybody. It's just what we do. And that's rebirth. And the Buddha turns around into space. So he turns his back on the light and it's the actual source is space. And so that's interesting. So you'll see that all over the place, even with Egyptians, like their treatment of Nut. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I don't know how to speak Egyptian, but like, the sky goddess, and they're like, this is infinite space, And so like, and that that vastness, that's really who we are. And what we're relating to ourselves is just like the tip of like what we ultimately are, like the tiniest little part,
This is the first time I've heard the source not being described as the light, but as space. That's interesting.
Right. It's the essence of your existence, it's a space. Nothing happens to the space, but it's alive. It's not nothing. It's not no thing,
Right.
What is that? That's the ayin, or the ayin and yesh, right? How do you say that? The ayin is not, and so the idea is that at the beginning, everything comes out of the ayin, right?
Yeah. When I sit every day, so I chant. I have a daily chanting practice, and then I say a prayer afterwards. I do this every morning, and one of the things that I say is Ein Sof when I'm saying the names of the eternal. which is Hebrew for, I should know what this means, but it basically means it's something to do with the no thingness, I believe. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. Like,
so it's the infinite. There is no end, right? So I don't know. I'm not David, and I like it when David goes full Dick Van Dyke singing about the Kabbalah. So I'll just in a second.
Well, it's or also it's the light. So it's Ein Sof Or is the full expression. So and that's infinite light in extension, you know, with no end.
Oh, I love that. I'm gonna add that to my prayer. Thank you. Ein Sof Or. Ein Sof Or.
I feel like the two are connected, or the three, right? So the Ayin Yesh is sort of like out of nothing, or out of no thing comes all thing, right? And from something from nothing, right? Something from nothing. So that I think Ayin Yesh is really tied to the Ein Sof as well. But then again, of course, it's a tree.
It's interesting. I once watched Christopher Hitchens debate this Christian theologian, and it was the one I watched it a long time ago when I was super dogmatic and strident and still identified a mainstream Christian, which I no longer identify as. So I was biased to see the Christian person as winning. Take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. However, it seemed to me that Christopher Hitchens actually lost that debate. And one of the what was compelling at the time was the Christian said, how can something come from nothing? He kept asking Christopher Hitchens. And it's so funny because now in my spirituality, in my relationship with spirituality, it's like, of course something comes from nothing. Because it's like I'm hearing it not as nothing, but as no thing. There is no fixed, permanent thing. It's constantly changing, constantly morphing, constantly shifting. But I feel like in the West, we don't have or many of us don't have the tools or the frameworks to like even have a sense of renewed Christianity or some of these other spiritual systems. Like we hear a very dogmatic, theistic, thingified way of hearing them. And I feel like if we could hear them in a different light, our relationship with these religions would actually be far more enriching and far more they would be able to renew themselves when they're not really able to renew themselves these days.
So I hear that. What I get out of that though is like, and take this as a bad metaphor or like similar logic strain though, is that if we gave people a reason to understand why they're learning math, that they would care about learning math more. I feel like it's really similar. There's a lot of it's kind of true, but at the same time, there's a lot of the time where it's like you just force kids to learn Hebrew or math, and then when it's like a violin in their hands, and when they're 20. They have their own relationship with what it is that they learned about. And I think my problem with Atlanticist or Western Christianity or like ideology is it's very post-Erasmus, very materialist, right? And I think materialism actually is the problem. Like when we're like, without nothing must be, if there's no thing, right? Because we're all materialists.
Right.
But if you get rid of the things and you start to think about what are these like transcendent non-things, well, like love, justice, the number 4, a straight line or a curve. And I think it's really important because we get stuck in this idea of emergent free will, right? The idea that we're expanding in phenomenological diversity from nothing into more things, which giving us the opportunity to make more choices, when really it seems more that we have infinite potential in the no thing state. And from there, we limit ourselves in order to egg ourselves on to do stuff with that limited canvas.
You know that in the end of the gospel, when Jesus is describing like basically how to follow Christ, like he has this whole there's it's like actually communicates something there because he's describing non-localization. It's such a trip because he's like and you go from place to place, and we treat that like in a missionary way, like. We're like, not sex wise, but like, you go out and you like, maybe that too. But, they know you'll be rejected by a lot of people. And so, and that actually like nowadays, like that really strengthens, it's almost, sorry, but it's like a cult type thing where you're like, if you go out and you get poor treatment and you come back to your clan and they're like, oh, how did it go? And you're like, well, this is what life was like among the pagans. You know, it's like it bonds you, it bonds the group, because you're like, we're in this together, and this whole kind of thing, you know. But I think when you go back to what's being communicated there in the gospel, it's more like that relates to Judaism too, like the 40 years in the desert, like the ability to not have to be localized, to have your peace with that. It has to do with your own personhood too, like your own treatment, your own relationship to your own body, and then applying that externally of how you relate to the world. So like, you know, that's why there's such a communication around how you end up with a land, because you're like, who does it belong to? Well, it belongs to Hashem, and we're the caretakers of that. And so you can see, like, culturally, like the shift in the way that, just like, you know, you people will look for loopholes, where it's like, that's the thing with the temple in the first place. The whole thing is built out of a loophole, because you say it won't be built by human hands, but then you just use material from someplace else, and that's, you know, the son of the person who was told not to build it by God, you know, not because you shouldn't, but because you can't, you know, but we do it anyway. And so
this is interesting. Wait, finish the last point, because I was having a jam session mentally with what you were saying, but I want to hear the rest of your point. So go ahead.
No, just, I guess the only other thing I would say is that that's just like a perpetuation of this continual fall. But the paradox of it is that when we take it to its ultimate end, we end up transformed, because it's in our nature. Like, it doesn't have to be this way, but due to our orientation, we get to a place where we have to learn in a primordial way. We have to learn by force. We shouldn't have to, but that's the way people are. So it's like you get it to a breaking point, you know, and that's the thing. You know.
Okay, so here's what's going on in my head right now. So when I hear words like materialism and non-localization, there's a flip side of it going on inside of me, which is like a critique of René Descartes.
Totally.
And the mind.
It's time.
And like his mind body like dualism, which in a way you could argue, you know, like desecrates the body and thus desecrates the material flesh, right? And there's obviously
animals, right?
Yeah, there's like a lot of this in Christianity, obviously. So like, and this deeply impacts me, I will say, in particularly as a woman, because I experience time and space in a very embodied fashion, right? In a very particular way, right? So like, I'm wondering how, like, when you say non-local, and then okay, so I'll take it from that to like, you know, we're seeing civic institutions erode. We've been seeing that for a long time. People don't actually meet in community, right? People don't go to church. People don't go to religious institutions to gather. People don't go, you know, bowling alleys to gather or whatever. We have seen community erode, and we're seeing people more hungry for that, to fill that void in their lives. So when you say non-localized space, and when you say materialism, how do you square that with these other trends that have been happening for a long time in the Western psyche?
Right. So there's two things happening at once, right? You when it comes to, like, so you have Descartes was like, I think therefore I am, but then there's also Hume. Like, you can't really have Descartes without Hume, at least for me, because he's like, I'm a feeling being. And the two don't have to be in conflict. I actually got a question wrong in community college over this issue. They're like, why were Descartes and Hume in disagreement? And I was like, I don't think that they really were. Like, they both came to what they came to in a logical way, and for both of them it makes sense. And it's like, you know, and so when I do a treatment of non-localization here in this sense, like, I'm talking about, like, there's like an externalized expression, but that's really like coming from something that's inside my sense of it. So it's like it's like that compulsion, like that fascination with like, how does this relate to me? Where it's like, there's like, I'm talking about ego. So it's like, if
that makes sense.
The center of everything in your thought process, and every thought that arises, you're like contracting and expanding, if it's affirming to that or if it denies that.
Yeah.
So like, and just like insult and compliment. But it's like, we do that within ourselves, right? And it's so, like, everybody does it in their own ways and to different degrees or whatever, but it's the same principle thing happening, where there's a center. And so what I'm talking about, like non-localization, spiritually speaking, it would be that is not the center. It can exist, but it's not like not everything is in relationship to that. And that's like what I've seen described by like in a Zendo, you know, from you know, monks would describe this way of relating to the world that isn't like what can I take, like everything that's assumed in like in your actions. It's not so much about your actions, it's where the actions are stemming from and all the assumptions you have about who you ultimately are that like dictate them. So like that's like the way I've had karma explained to me, that it's not so much like action reaction, it's actually in the moment itself is the karma, because everything you assume about yourself and your relationship to others that is displayed in your action, you know, like that is its own karma, like that, you know what I mean? Like in that moment, you're limiting yourself and you're confined in that, and it's not a good place to be.
David, I some people would take offense. I don't take offense, but you're being very hard on humans when you're like, oh, that's our fault, and we're materialistic, but like,
yeah, but who cares about meat bags, man?
One of the lines on this thread is, I remember from the Upanishads. I think it was either Upanishads or the Gita. But there's this like question that almost snapped me out of like being agnostic almost, and it's just, why is there something rather than nothing? And that's kind of like whatever made that decision, or whatever caused, whatever synthesized the something from the nothing. That's the thing that we should all be blaming for all of humans' shortcomings and for being materialistic, right? Like the exact moment that nothing became something, that was what gave birth to materialism, is it not?
Well, this is a little of a sidetrack, but it bears saying that Descartes happened right before drugs, and
dude,
this is
no. I'll die on this hill real quick.
Hume happened right after drugs, and so like if you look at the timeline in between 1590s and the 1600s, Hume is actually seeing. Descartes is actually seeing the beginning of the not quite libertine movement, right? If you've seen like the libertines. John Wilmot was a libertine who died at 33 years old of like syphilis and every drug, you know, from sugar cane to cocaine. Like he had anything that was, this is the beginning of all of it, right? And he's like, well, like existentialism, live to the fullest. And he was very instrumental in getting the King Charles II put back in power of England, because they were, he figured that a lord would protect his rights to pleasure, etc. But they were seeing how their minds were rotting, and by going so hard, how they couldn't trust their empiricism anymore. And I think that's really, you don't agree? Also, someone said Aunt Jemima look.
Yeah, no, I wanted to say it, but it wasn't the right time.
I just think it never will be. But honestly, we should put him on the syrup. You know,
really, because I think of Grey Gardens when I see that. But you know,
I just have to say that I feel personally, but I think there's compelling proof that that Rene Descartes was a psychonaut, that he actually did the equivalent of DMT, cannabis, a whole bunch of these things. In fact, there's a book called The Voyage to the World of Cartesius, or the Cartesian Voyage, and I believe it was published in 1640 or 1680, and it's somewhat a sarcastic approach, but it was written by a guy that was within the lifetime of his mentor being a contemporary of Rene Descartes. And he claimed that Rene Descartes, and this is kind of known, that he would go off into like these weird like stupors, and some of it was blamed on seizures and all sorts of issues. But this book claims that he was actually snorting some sort of DMT and was actually projecting and getting information from the Akashic records directly. And that's all in this book right here.
I wouldn't be surprised.
It's 1692, so it has to be true.
There was to be fair, like there were things people did, like wormwood and everything else like that.
Sure.
Like,
you know,
go ahead.
Do you know that some have said, where did I see this? Some have said that the Book of Revelation, which was written on the Isle of Patmos in ancient Greece, was covered in shrooms.
Yeah, right. This
so
totally...
John was just like having a trip.
That he was doing the shrooms. It just means that
it's like in the atmosphere.
I mean,
clearly the burning bush was salvia.
They gave Buddha the wrong mushroom and he died from it.
Yeah, right.
Is that what they say?
That's canon. Is that not canon?
Is that canon? Tell me.
Yeah, his last meal was a mushroom, and I believe that was why a lot of Asian cultures or Buddhists like for a while looked down on mushrooms en masse because it was the thing that took their homeboy out.
Oh wow,
that's interesting.
Fascinating.
I think the idea though of the material reality, like that's again, we need to look at the difference between European humanism and the Neoplatonic values, like this idea that like numbers are angels, like John Dee even said these things, right? And there's like a mystical reality that they're trying to control from thought into realizing to real, as opposed to from real into affecting thought. And that's the argument I see. I see people trying to change the world through people rather than figure out how to live, be part of the world, right?
Have you guys looked at Jung's Red Book, like not like the reader's edition, but like the real Red Book?
Yeah.
And like
I have it in my office.
Okay, well, if you could pull it out, maybe if it's close by. But there's like
it's not unfortunately.
In the how I forget what they call it. I feel dumb right now. But that when the first letter of a page is like all fancy, where they like do a whole thing with it, and there'll be like flowers and stuff. Like, oh, you got it. If you could, yeah, it's like. To me, and it's been a while, but I felt like I was looking at like different I don't know if it was like Belladonna, Morning Glories, Jimson Weed, or something like that. I was like, are those like, and I was like thinking to myself, I was like, is he like taking these things when he writes these sections and like has it, because he's like doing this, like it's such a psychedelic book, you know? I'm like, is there something else happening there? But it's super speculative. I'm not, you know, I'm not saying I know that, but I think you're muted.
Wouldn't put it past him.
Some of the Red Book reminds me of the Codex Gigas, right? Like, if you've checked the Codex Gigas, it's like this.
I'm not familiar with this.
As one does.
As one does. AKA the giant book, the Codex Gigas.
Oh, I've seen this. Yeah,
big old book. So, little lore for you: a Bohemian monk in the Czech Republic in the 13th century ate something and then wrote something. Basically, we're talking like a book that they say should have taken 20 years or should have been done like it was done in one night or something like that over the entire period of time. And it's like not just that he was on crack, because it's also it's all these demons and Goetia and all of these things like that. But if you look, where's my I lost it already, my Jung book. You look at some of the pictures in the Jung art, and it kind of reminds me of that. It reminds me of the Gigas.
Sure. Where's the one where he's cutting off the legs of the lizard to make it a snake, and it's all this blood everywhere and it's all nuts? Is that in that image search you were just looking at?
Maybe. You mean like in the Gigas or in Jung's Red Book?
No, in Jung's Red Book, man, where he's got like some of the imagery in there. It's fucking insane.
Let me see. I don't know. I have to scour it. This one?
Yeah, there it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Pull that up.
Right.
Yeah.
Quetzalcoatl.
Well, it's like, I think like when I look at this, I'm like, it's very much like a lot of the stuff in the book is like dream imagery, but it's like, you know, that the serpent had legs, right, in the garden, you know, it's like, so he's like cutting the legs off of that serpent. To me, feels like something to do with like, you know, the fall or something. I don't know, but yeah, it's trippy.
That's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder in terms of just Jung in his search, right? The idea that the non things were more eternal because things are emergent and they change over time, and there's entropy towards form. But do you believe in like a primordial divine architecture or things like that, like principles, divine principles, if not things? In the no thing?
I think like yin yang is probably what I would say as a response to that, like but I haven't really given much thought to it, to be honest. I read Maps of Meaning in 2020, and I remember it resonating with me profoundly. And I also watched Jordan Peterson's lectures on Maps of Meaning, in particular, his college lectures. And I thought that was pretty profound. But I don't really have the lexicon or the vocabulary to put it in my own word about what I think the primordial substance, so to speak, is, because I think there is nothing that I could say that would actually describe it or capture it. Like I could point to metaphors, you know, again, like the yin yang as a symbol for that. But I can't say that I have any concrete opinions on what it's made up of or
do you think that straight lines exist before we think of them, or do you think that like there are primordial...
Oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting question.
If you're talking about lines of force, you're not necessarily talking about the same thing when we think of a straight line or we draw a straight line, right? Like if you're talking
are you
about
asking if there's a created relationship that is this, like, are you saying, is there a relationship that has to exist in order for something to exist?
I believe that.
I think in the way that a platonic solid has to exist for like a perfect sphere, or like an imperfect sphere to exist in our reality in that case.
Right, but you need some directional force outside of the thing itself in order for it to divide, in order to expand. So like you're describing, like when you're looking at cell growth, you're looking at a sphere like having like a movement, like there's torque involved, like there's like something like, and so and there's like an organizing principle. There's like it organizes itself in response to a distortion being introduced. And we have this relativity of like the thing is dividing and it's expanding at the same time, which are really kind of two sides to the same movement, you know? So, like if it was just everything was completely a perfect vector metric and there was no, distortion introduced, it would just be static, would it not? Like you need that twisting element. That's what gets me when I look at like Einstein's like unified field theory ideas, where he has that diagram of the sphere on the plane, and the plane sinks down and you're looking at this grid, and I'm like, there's no twist. Why isn't there a twist? Like it's because isn't that what it is? Like, so yeah, I'm a huge fan of the double torus, because I feel like that's like our electromagnetic energy field that can be measured. And you don't necessarily even like, you're like, when people talk about spirituality, I'm like, or like people talk about God, I'm like, well, what is energy? Like, do we even know? Like we can use something, we can direct something just like we can in ourselves. Like there's electricity in us. Electricity is powering this, the technology that we're using in order to communicate right now. But like, it's still all the same thing. And like, what is it? Is it a limited resource? Like, you know what I mean? Like, is it going to run out? I don't think so. So, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think it, like when King said something bends towards justice, I think it bends towards something, like reality bends towards something. I read this really beautiful quote that I am not going to remember completely, but basically this guy was looking at the distinction between power and force, and he's saying that people misuse the word power, and what they really mean is force, and this is related to capoeira. He said that force is like it's a distortion, but power is like gravity. It's silent, and I have to find this quote, actually. I'm going to try to find it right quick because I think it's worth saying full, because I would love to know what you all think about it.
Let me open up the link that Thomas sent a second ago.
I feel like this is very important. It seems like such a weird little technicality, and this is also gives us a sync back to Carl Jung through Edward Bernays.
And the Jews.
So this is the concept of the Buddha dying because he was served and what it looks like pig. And I think that according to my Rockefeller Gordon Wasson research training, but that this was a mistranslation, that he didn't eat a pig, he ate the food of a pig, and the food of a pig would be mushrooms or truffles. And what happened according to Gordon Wasson was that he was prepared what were supposed to be magic mushrooms or perhaps Amanita muscaria, but the people that prepared it for him didn't understand what they were looking at. They prepared a poisonous mushroom and served it to him, and this gets mistranslated as he ate pork and died from the pork. No, he ate a mushroom because a mushroom was of pork, and then he died from that, and this turns into this whole taboo. And the reason this connects back to Jung is through Edward Bernays is a member of Century Club, as is Robert Gordon Wasson, as is Henry Luce of Time Life magazine, and they're the ones that bring the magic mushroom into popular culture through Lifetime magazine and essentially Skull and Bones.
Right. Although I don't know how nefarious all of that necessarily is. with that? Like you're saying, are you saying that the mistranslation was an intentional mistranslation,
No,
or it was like Moses had horns and he really had rays? What's that?
I don't think that at all, and I think there's also like a somewhat of an aspect of, oh, thank God that we've got this white guy from the 50s that corrected, centuries of religion and tradition. But there does seem to be some, because I believe the exact same way about the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church originally was all about psychedelics and the Eucharist and the Holy Grail. We've been over this a million times, but that the mistranslation, it doesn't matter if it was intentional or not, because the end result is that now people are like following these very specific rules about something that's been like completely mistranslated since forever.
Yeah, and that makes you wonder though also about pigs, because if it's not just like pigs, then maybe kosher is not even just about killing the pig, but the fact that if you're a nomadic tribe and you have pigs and then they're making mushrooms or something like that, you're trying to keep them from having the epigenetic fetish, right?
Well, that's
that's
interesting.
Wow.
I found the quote. I can read it now. It's from David Hawkins. It's called Power versus Force. So he says, power is still like gravity, whereas force moves, creating counterforces in conflict. Where power is total and complete, force is partial and thus insatiable in its constant need for external energy. Power requires nothing from outside and makes no demands. It energizes, gives forth, supplies, and supports life. Force depletes, consumes, wears down, and takes life. Power is associated with compassion, force with judgment. Power makes people feel positive about themselves, while force leads its practitioners to feel poorly, ashamed, embarrassed, or vulnerable to loss of face. And I think there's a little bit of like, he's distinguishing basically between like ego and higher self. Especially with that last paragraph where he says that force is associated with like, you don't want to lose face, you don't want to look bad, you don't want to look wrong, and that's very like egocentric.
Right, we could get real anthropological with that, because there's also like the idea that the integrity in nature would be, in this case, the context of what you're describing would be power, because
exactly.
It's that what exists, it's like what gives the strength to organic life, and then there's kind of like a substitute version of that exists in the world where it's like, if there is a matrix, like I think that's what it is that projection and everything that's like implied in our relationship to material existence, that kind of like determines what our notion of strength is, because power or force, in this case, the way you're describing it, like that really like resonates with like, well, what is strength? So like, is receptivity itself a form of strength? Like, is the ability to be okay with being uncomfortable, like, is that strength?
Right.
Because if somebody doesn't have that and they're reacting, like, that's my thing with like the reptile thing, like with David Icke or whatever. I'm like, did he just see some ancient description of what the middle brain, how it is? Like, because your attention, like in a fight or flight situation, like your attention is so narrowed down that your reaction is like you're doing things before you even realize that you're doing them. And like, that's like, that might serve a real function. Like if you're faced with something that's actually threatening your physical, being, like if there's a fucking, a bear or something that's going to attack you, like you want that
you
to
can
be
say
an ability.
a reptilian. You don't have to say a bear.
It could be a giant reptile is attacking you. You want your reptilian brain to respond faster
That's
than
what it's
you would
for.
normally
It's for the reptile.
Right. It has its place. But then we apply that to like when our fucking like projected image of who the fuck we think we are is threatened, that actually can't even be. There's actually like, there is no threat. So people can be, reacting to social media like they're encountering a threat, and really like there's nothing there. That's also ties back to what I was saying about non-localization. Like, like you don't, and it's like everybody participates in that, it's so strange.
I'm glad you give me another word for ego.
Well, you could like narcissist, not as the way that it's generally completely being thrown around on the internet right now, like even though that is a conversation, but like in terms of the actual mythological story, like the allegory itself of like that he sees his reflection and wants to see that everywhere and everything,
Yeah.
I feel like we have more like idiots than like egotists these days. Right. It's interesting because people always thought like the ego death would be like the solution, but look at Zoomers, you know, like there's a lot of.
The problem with the ego is that it never stays dead.
Well, I think that even if I mean, kind of, but really, like it becomes the id becomes this insatiable thing, because without the ego, it's like a neutered dog that like wants to eat like chocolate all the time. Like the id takes over.
Well, it's alchemy, because it's the thing in itself, the very thing that we relate to as the problem, which we could call like our pain body. Like, so when you're like put in a place where you're like get that sense where you're like crawling out of your skin, like if you're really affected, you know, that's energy, but there's a strain on that energy. It's the same thing. Like if you're crying, there's so much tension in it. But like, you know, when you're laughing, it's like an exercise. Like I've had nights where like I've done psychedelics in the woods with you know, at an event or whatever, and like by the morning, like I've laughed so much that I can feel my occipital ridge like opened, and it's like the most freaking healing, because we hold so much tension in between our occiput and our scapula, and just to like have a whole release with that, it's like, oh my god, like, and your diaphragm, everything that does for you, but it's all part of a continuum. Like they're not separate, they're distinct, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, Andreas, can you describe what you mean more by id as distinct from the ego?
Yeah, so I would say like I think of the id as like desires and driving forces of like what your body needs, but necessarily need is not necessarily need, because it can be like drugs or hormonal responses, or you know, existential responses that just feel good. It's kind of a more animalistic state. And I feel like the ego is a bit more about it's hard to just explain. Like it's about the maintenance of the self, or the sustainability of the self over a long period of experiences. So you change, and your ego changes, and you're in the idea of growing and like what you want to be perceived as, you know, like with your super ego. But you can lose that, right? And so there's a lot of great examples, like Ram Dass has talked about like the ego death is a very valuable thing, because then you can start, a lot of people, I think that's more essential in the 1950s and 60s. If you're a boomer who was always told, go to your room, and your room had like a nice stereo in it, and that was your place of peace. This also is why, like, this is a post-plague idea of introversion. I think a lot of the intellectual success of introversion comes from that idea. Well, if I stay out of the realm of society, I'll be able to be myself. This is also where closeted comes from. I was like learning about this month, right? The idea that your closet is a place where you can paint it colors and do whatever you want. Like people were not going out into society and being themselves as much because of the fear of the superego, right? And so when you get to the point where like it's all about me and myself, like then you want to like shut, because luckily there's other parts of you. So if you shut that down, you don't die. And it will the other, like a seizure, like, or a brain hemorrhage, another part of the brain will try to pick up, if possible, the slack, the loss of effort being done by your ego, right? But your ego isn't evil. It's not necessarily evil. It's just been forced to be, in an American sense, in charge of itself.
Yeah. You know what? Can I just say, like, in this is so strange, but like 2001: A Space Odyssey, like they shut down HAL, right? But like that whole buildup, they have a mission. So this is a Jupiter mission, 18 months after they find the thing on the surface of the moon. And you're like, okay, so like if you were to relate that to like, he is the ego of the ship. He's like, that's like an entity, right? And you're like, this is like an archetypal thing. So it's like you can't complete the mission until you shut him down. But the mission extends beyond what we are to believe the mission even is. So like that's like intellect. Like intellect has all these ideas around what it is that your mission is in this world. But it's like, you know, and so when you talk about like ego death, it's like that's not the end of the, because that no longer are you like on what you thought the mission was. You're like actually coming into contact with what the real mission is. That's actually related to something that's, you know, organic and spiritual, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's a good metaphor. That resonates to me.
Eyes Wide Shut, he gets his ego rocked, and then he's walking around, he's showing everyone his ID, showing everyone his id, and the whole thing is his ego gets rocked, and then he's led by his dick. and his dick gets him into all kinds of trouble and probably loses him his daughter at the very end. And so
yeah,
like,
I think that's something we're not bringing up enough. I was trying to like downplaying, which I shouldn't, is like Wilhelm Reich's mass psychology of fascism and sexuality of fascism, and the idea of control through the id, right? Control through sex, but there's so much to that, right? To orgone energy, that idea that there's more, like we're seeing the symptomatic aspect of it through like the sexuality of humanity, and how confused we are about it is really proportional to how much control the state has put over that. Like an authoritarian state, like the Puritans, or certain kinds of Islam, or even eunuchs in Tibet, right? Like there's sexual control leads to when people either are allowed to do it, like, okay, now you're a soldier and we're going to give you a sex slave wife, or I never have this control, so I'm going to go kill and have the craziest sex while sniffing glue, that I can do.
Bath salts, but same thing.
You've never sniffed glue? Try it. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. It's bad. One time I was in Bolivia and I was walking down the street and there was this guy. I had a shoe that was like flipping open because it was falling apart. And then I saw this guy sniffing glue and I bought glue from him. And then I rubbed it on my shoe, like right in front of him. And he looked at me like, "What are you doing, man? Wasting it." Yeah, it was like, oh my God. Here, I'll open up David's.
Yeah, so when I watched the Jordan Peterson talk that you had, I was thinking at the time that I wanted to share this quote with you. It's not about Don John. I mean,
I love Don John.
That's just
I haven't seen this movie.
You haven't seen this movie? You gotta see this movie.
Okay.
Could you blow up that writing right there?
Yeah, but I'll be thinking about Don John confessing and praying while lifting. All right, keep going.
Okay, so this is from Wilhelm Reich in the Mass Psychology of Fascism. So he says, at the time when this book was originally written, fascism was generally regarded a political party, which, like any other social group, was an organized representation of a political idea. According to this concept, the fascist party introduced fascism by force or by political maneuver. Contrary to this concept, my medical experience with individuals from all kinds of social strata, races, nationalities, and religions showed me that fascism is only the politically organized expression of the average human character structure, a character structure which has nothing to do with this or that race, nation, or party, but which is general and international. In this characterological sense, fascism is the basic emotional attitude of man in authoritarian society, with its machine civilization and its mechanistic, mystical view of life. It is the mechanistic, mystical character of man in our times which creates fascist parties, and not vice versa. So it felt really applicable as you were talking with Jordan Peterson, because I was just like, wow, this is really reminding me of that it's like, what, because the issue is one of neuroses and what we build out of that neuroses, and we're relating to it backwards, generally speaking, because we're trying to do reformation on what is further down the line of how this comes to be in the first place. And this is why Wilhelm Reich was considered basically an enemy of the state, because people were quitting their fucking factory jobs because they were just like, wow, what is life about? What is it, And like, I used to have when I read that book the first time, and also The Function of Orgasm, I had like some difficulty with his use of the word mysticism. And I know that he was a contemporary of Jung, to some overlap there. And I'm like, how is he using that? And then it was like in 2016, and not to say that this is the only example, but I realized what he was reacting to when he looked at like, the way that symbols get imbued. So like, everybody does it and it's just propaganda, but it's like the Make America Great Again red cap, like that as just like a symbol. And you're like, and but you could go there with anything. You could go there with masks, almost have like all these ideas attached to it, which is belief. So we're imbuing the symbol with belief, and we wear it, and it's like a pride thing that's not really a dignifying thing because it's so territorial or it's tribal in nature. But like that is a mystical phenomenon. Like they're imbuing it, but it's not like true mysticism. It's not like, it has no real spirituality. I would call it like a substitute mysticism. And it's like we have like there's another place where we put that, because people crave ritual, and if they don't not doing it consciously, they'll gravitate towards whatever it is, and they'll make a religion out of whatever it is, whether it's science, whether it's gender as an ideological phenomenon, like not like it's just these different treatments that we have to these things, like we imbue them with so much force. Not power, but the force, like there's that distinction, if they were imbued with power, we wouldn't need flags. I think God hates flags, personally.
God hates
yeah.
Oh my God.
Boo.
Huh.
I'd like state seals, Thomas. We know.
I don't think God hates anything, by the way. I'm just saying that.
Yeah, God integrates. What about
God integrates?
Wilhelm Reich is really cool. I like that one too. Wilhelm Reich is cool. Wilhelm Reich is cool because he was trying to figure out what forces in nature were also making up humanity. And we look at it as mysticism. Some people might look at it as monadicism, right? And also particle wave theory. He's like, how much are we particles affecting the waves? How much are we waves affected by affecting the particles, right? And the idea that you could find something in your sexuality or your libido that's tied to energy is now a lot more common. We're doing MRIs and things like that. But also his thought that you should put someone, if someone's feeling like strange, in a chamber that's keeping radio waves around them, away from them, right? The orgon chamber is this little box you get inside of that is basically a Faraday cage, right? And if that was useful with the natural radio waves 100 years ago, I can only imagine it's even cooler today with cell phones and Wi-Fi everywhere to be able to get out of those and have your own frequencies kind of reset, right? And people look crazy. Yeah, they think it is completely crazy, but they took away his orgon chamber. The government shut him down, not just for doing orgon chamber, but also for weather control machines. So the idea that emotions and people's emotions were affecting the weather, something that also Native American tribes who do like rain dances and things like that have associated. But today we have HARP and we have all these other pieces of technology.
He used to go town to town, literally charging towns money to do cloud busting or cloud seeding, right? That's how he actually raised money for a while. So when it did, and that was like the same little, Chris, like the resin organite things that they sell now on like Amazon and eBay and stuff. But it's like that same thing can change your life, and we can also use it to make rain, essentially.
Right, but there's a progression that happened with him that I think is kind of like important syntax wise. Like when he was in Vienna, and he's actually like in the psychoanalytic society, him being different and more open-minded than a lot of the people around him, like was like expressed a certain way. And if you look at the function of orgasm, you can see that like the last chapter is completely different than the rest of the book, where he doesn't mention orgon through the whole thing, and then he comes in with that. And then you can also see that like he was actually excommunicated by Freud's daughter, so like she kicked him out. Like he was actually relatively okay with Freud, but it's like,
well, there's a whole story there too that Freud may have got him to have sex with his mother, right? Like there's a lot.
I'm not familiar with this. What do you got? You got
some
gossip on?
Well, I don't have the whole story, but I've heard that Wilhelm Reich was, Freud's patient, and he was convincing him that he had a sexual romance with his mother, and that was Freud's thing. And Wilhelm Reich was really like a literalist and a pragmatist, so he was trying, and he was easy to convince that he needs to do things to unlock problems with his psychology. So the story is that Freud convinced him to have sex with his mother, and that it like definitely wasn't the right answer. Right?
No, that wouldn't be the right answer for him. I don't.
No,
think.
That would not be the right answer.
I'm totally like I'm open to anything. Like, but I would need to see like that more than more than a citation. I need to like delve into where this.
Oh, I thought you were debating on like the practice of sleeping with your mother in order to get some kind of enlightenment.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to see the numbers on this.
Does it have to be your actual mother, or could it just be your father's wife?
You said he was a literalist, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Jodorowsky would advise people to take a like bit of lingerie or something from their mother, and to like basically just go to town with that as a way to kind of like immerse yourself in some kind of like playing out of something, so you can get it out of your system. so you can move on. Like, oh, that's something that's in there, you know. But yeah,
are you guys familiar at all with Eric Newman's work and his level of analysis? And do you have any thoughts on that? Because he wrote like a lot of works that I find incredibly compelling, and some say that he was going to be the next Jung had he not died at such an early age.
Tell us more about Edwin Newman.
Eric Newman.
Eric Newman.
Yeah. So Eric Newman was some say like Carl Jung's protege, and he wrote a number of books. The books that he wrote on Judaism are actually the ones I'm most fascinated by. He wrote a 2-part series on Judaism, and one of the things he explored was Judaism's relationship with the feminine and the masculine, and how it manifested in things like circumcision and the story of Sinai and the story of the receiving of the Ten Commandments and all those, and also just like the land as the feminine sort of representation and the people masculine representation. I don't know, it's interesting. You just reminded me of that as you were discussing Freud and his relationship to sexuality and so on and so forth.
I'm interested in this too because Freud wrote Osarsiph of Moses and Akhenaten, right? And so I think Freud didn't go far enough, which is like not a popular opinion, or it is a hot take, but that he said that Osarsiph, not about the Oedipian complex, but about Moses and the idea that Moses was, you know, a fabled figure from a historical time, and that time, from what we can tell, is basically the time of Akhenaten, and Akhenaten had a priest named Osarsiph, and they were probably of the Hyksos and the Hyksos, or some sort of a Semitic foreign ruling class that had been in charge of Egypt, not slaves, but in control, especially after droughts and famines, and that they were on the outs after a century or so, and that Moses or Akhenaten or Osarsiph, whichever it is, builds henotheistic Atanism, where you worship the son of God, and they move for about 40 years to Amarna, right? 40 years in this desert where they built their city, which is disconnected and collapsed. So I find it interesting, the connections between Abrahamic Judaism and, you know, the law of Moses and Ptahhotep and Egyptian and Kemetic philosophy, and the divine feminine particularly is interesting because the Deuteronomists have kind of, at the time of Josiah and the fall of the first temple, they remove Asherah. Asherah is the wife of Elion, right? And they have a pantheon because Elohim is plural. So Elohim means, like, it's like Anunnaki. It's like those are them. Like, it's not to say the one guy.
Right. Male and female created he, them. And meanwhile, Tetragrammaton is male, female, actually. I mean, it's 4 letters that go in that order, you know. So that's the thing.
Abba could have, like, that's what Abba could have been called. That was their second choice for a name. Yeah.
The thing with Freud is I thought that I was just like reading into something, because I was studying Zohar and I was like looking at Freud for a period of time years ago, and I was like, am I tripping, or am I just like, because there's that thing where if you're looking at 2 things back and forth, you can like, you're like, how much am I projecting this into that? But then I told my friend Znor this in a podcast a while ago, my friend in Japan, and he was like, oh dude, there's like I think he said 3 books written on that Freud took from Zohar, like a bunch. But the thing is that he was in Vienna when he was there, and it's like, if that was to come out, because he was trying to substantiate the Psychoanalytic Society as something totally different, like he could not call that Jewish mysticism. That he wouldn't have been able to continue. And the thing is that Jung was German, or Swiss, and surrounded by a lot of Jewish people in that, you know, in that circumstance. And so, you know, when it comes to like looking at letters between Freud and Jung, like you can see that it's like there's certain things that they just can't talk about, especially record. So it's like some of the issues that Freud had with Jung, I think, was that Jung would get so interested in these mystical texts, like the Chinese stuff and all these things that he was looking into, and alchemy, and then sharing. And it was like Freud was like, no, I'm separating what is like what I'm seeing essentially in there, and then I'm applying it in a different way. And he was like, you're messing with it, but at the same time, it's like Jung was free to do that. If Freud did that, it wouldn't work out for him. So he was denied that kind of creativity. And I think that that's kind of like what made him added to his pessimism, you know, because he's doing some really good coke. Like he should have at least for like a while been for a period of time been really positive, you know.
Johnny Depp as Freud. I can't wait to see the movie.
Yeah. But you know, it's like I think that there was kind of a contention there between them, and probably a resentment from Freud too.
The galvanization of 19th century spiritualism from materialism, and you see this with Das Kapital. Das Kapital, I've decided, is my favorite 19th century horror fantasy. It is though. Like if you think about it, if you
horror fantasy, you said.
Hear me out. So if you think about it, like Frankenstein's monster or other examples of 19th century horror fantasy, you have to have this sort of ambiguous evil, right? And so people love this. The people love vampire stories, but then you'll be like, you know, vampires are really like people that kidnap kids, right? Or like the movie It is about John Wayne Gacy. You know, you can't tell kids the clown is the
right.
So there's all these little things, and you're like, oh, when you get a little bit older, you're like, oh, that was what I was so afraid of. There's a real attachment to that thing. So materialism becomes really important, and everyone's like, oh, really? The spiritual thing is just a misunderstanding of the real thing, and the material thing is real, so real is material. So then you say, okay, Frankenstein's monster. Well, we've created this thing, which is capitalism, and capitalism is a force of evil that will infect the human mind, the human condition, the society, the environment, and everything else. But it's like, it's so ambient and immaterial, right? Because it's using the material, but it is a force, like a dark force, that is the Frankenstein's monster. And so, you know, in a lot of ways, that's the example of how materialism starts to push against spirituality and saying, okay, well, spiritualism is just not studying hard enough. And if they just looked around, like, maybe they're not even that, it's that they're trying so hard to make metaphors about things that are literal. And I think that's also the division, because then you have spiritualists saying, well, you can't trust anything you experience. I know deaf and blind people and drug addicts, so you can't trust your empiricist experience.
I have to just point that whenever Frankenstein comes up, I think there might be validity that was actually a book about the Bavarian Illuminati, because the timelines and the geography of that just line up too well for it not to be, which would be more specific than capitalism.
That's a pretty good example, yeah. This is NASA's cloud busting machine, clouds being made by NASA, and then like Civil War surveillance balloons, but also the balloons at the Civil War they also had weather cloud machines where they'd make these giant clouds with chemical smoke and everything, which would eventually create precipitation. So yeah, weather machines have been around for a while. I think it's interesting though to tie it to the human mind, right? Like, do you feel, like some people say they can sense the weather? Like, do you think that we're that intrinsically tied to, you know, energy flows and forms?
I knew recently that it was going to rain because I smelled the rain. It's an olfactory setting, and also there were seagulls in the city. I live in Brooklyn, and I was like, oh, why are seagulls away from the shoreline? And it turns out that the combination of that is an indication that it's going to rain, and then it started raining. I definitely think that we're embedded. I mean, we come out of nature, so why wouldn't we be able to detect things like that on something?
Yeah, I find that interesting because it's like those are all very material, like signs that we can see, but are they because of like energy waves that the birds are sensing because they can sense north, like with their magnetic compass?
Yeah.
Is there more?
Yeah. You're talking about that earlier with the birds circling, like you were describing that, and like I'm like I this one Beltane, I was like I took like family LSD, you know, it's like for, you know, it's a tab. And in the morning, I remember, my girlfriend at the time, we both had the same experience. We were looking at the birds in the sky, these like birds of prey, and there was like a bunch of them, and we could see where they were going before they would go there to like more than like literally like visually. So it was like there was like a like, you know, a flower of life grid across the sky, and we could see their path like long before they got there, like when it would twist around and stuff. And it's like, and they would do just that, like it was on a track. And it was like, it was
That's
oh
cool.
man, And it's one thing, you know, when you have an experience and you're like, oh yeah, I was really tripping. But when you're like asking the person next to you, like, do you see that? And they're like, oh yeah, what's up with that? You know,
that's super cool.
Yeah.
Wow. What type of LSD was that?
It was family. In other words, it had like the Grateful Dead logo on there. It was like it may have actually have been honestly acid. Like, and that's not altogether that uncommon. People also recreate that same exact formula, which is one of the things with LSD that's like different than certain things like weed. Like weed, a strain can be gone and be basically gone forever. Like if you're gonna see the skunk bud that we saw in the 90s, like again, like you'll see something labeled skunk or Maui Wowie or Acapulco Gold or whatever, and you're like, that's not really that strain anymore.
Yeah, shout out to that OG Florida Crippy.
Yeah, you can actually recreate if you know if one knows what they're doing. Apparently, you can recreate what it was exactly. So you can have that thing that they were on during Hair, like when they're like when Hair was on Broadway, like what those people were eating. It's like you can't have that with like cocaine. You can't have Chevy Chase's coke when he was like had a floor to himself with the people in the NBC building doing Saturday Night Live. You know, like that's not like available anymore.
You can go to Bolivia.
Well, oh sure, it exists, but it's not, you know, like okay, I guess you're right.
Chloe has a really fantastic video. I wanted to segue into this thought on what is the value of human life, but that's kind of a trick question because it's based on this patriarchy, transgenderism, evolution. Maybe talk about debt. Do you want to maybe can you sum this up real quick? Like, I know you did it. You summed it in 14 minutes. Now do it again in 3. No,
I can try. So Debt was this really great book written by David Graeber, who sadly passed away in 2020, but he was an awesome anthropologist who wrote a lot of interesting things. The second chapter, so the book is about the history of debt. The second chapter explores debt through the lens of ancient Mesopotamia, where Graeber argues that basically like the aristocracy forced peasants, well, when the peasants couldn't pay their debts, which were like totally arbitrary, the aristocracy forced those peasants and those farmers to sell their wives and their daughters into sex slavery, which created the patriarchy, because the patriarchy was originally patriarchs trying to protect their wives and their daughters from being sold into sex slavery, but it was a double bind because what ended up happening was that they started to perceive their wives and daughters as property. And so I think it's actually in the second or third chapter of the book. So I talk about how an inability to like reckon with that leads to commodification of the body in general, which leads to some of the things we're seeing in transgenderism as a political ideology, whereby like if a person if a woman in particular is taught that her body is less than a man's, which has been something that has been inculcated, let's say in patriarchy, then why wouldn't she feel on some level some pressure to transition into a man? And there's an irony in that many conservative men, and here I'm thinking of Ben Shapiro in particular, many conservative men who come from a tradition of the patriarchs, right? Like when I read this book, I actually had a great deal of empathy for patriarchy, because I was like, oh, when the Hebrew patriarchs were complaining about the city life, this is what they were complaining about. And when they were coming up with all of these very misogynistic like ideas about women, it was in response to city life. Tower of Babel story is in response to city life. It's in response to the impression that they felt from the cities. However, at the same time, fast forward to 2024, you have people like Ben Shapiro, who's an Orthodox Jew, who reads every day. I think every day. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. If he does like 3 times.
Yeah, he reads every day, but it's mostly just Garfield comics. No, I'm just kidding.
Anyway, he reads every day a particular blessing that says, "Thank you, God, for not making me a woman," right? Thank you, God, that I was not born a woman, which comes out of that very long history. But this same person complains about transgenderism and complains like, why are young women wanting to transition and become men? Where it's like there's a connection actually between patriarchy and transgenderism, and that's what I expound upon in that video.
Well, in regards to Judaism, you can see, I talk about this a lot here, but like there's a dramatic shift that happened with the Ari being influenced by Aristotle. So Aristotle
Ooh,
had like
more.
what I would call a dualistic framework. And so like, and you had, so even the mystics were relating to things through a different lens than they had before. So like, if you're speaking like in the mystical tradition, like Keter, the crown has two right sides, because things literally like, it's all about that twist. And you'll see it throughout Judaism, you know, you'll see it with the Shefa, you'll see it with, or, you know, with the way that things, you know, that twist. And they saw that was like something that was foundational, like everything, like you can extrapolate all the Platonic solids from a single figure of a hexagram, right? So like if you, it just, and so that we put it on a flag and we nationalize that, which in my view is like, that is like a mistake all on its own, like just that conflation. Like we should, like, these are distinct things. There's two different orders to the Sephiroth. There's like the organic natural order, and then there's like what we're building with our minds. And so like to be able to maintain that distinction, and you'll see that throughout various mystery schools. And so like it's so central, because it's not about the school, it's about what's being pointed to. Like it's something that we need to distinguish between. And that's like part of the function of intellect is to recognize that there's two different orders, because one is mimicking the other one, and it's only going to be able to approximate it because the other one's perfect. Because there's like a primary order that's like perfect, like it is that intelligence, you know. And so like we can only kind of like try and understand that intelligence through representation.
And you watched Star Trek when you were young, Chloe?
No, but I watched Star Wars, and oh yes, I do know that symbol. It's also the Kohanim symbol, I've been told.
Right. So that's the whole, that's a quick point, which was just like Leonard Nimoy as a kid invented the Star Trek symbol by taking it from the symbol women make in the Cohenite priestesses, essentially, right? Or when everyone.
Oh, it's the priestesses that make this symbol. I didn't know that.
When men.
A priest. I'm not sure about that. I'm gonna have to question you on that one.
Maybe I'm incorrect. I thought it was that men closed their eyes and the women made the symbols. Was what Leonard Nimoy.
I think it's the women. I think the Cohen does that. But yeah.
This is also the Anahata symbol, of course, in Vedic traditions, which I find fascinating. That these two symbols, well, that this symbol is found in. That this symbol in like the chakra is the Anahata open-hearted symbol, and is of course the symbol of Judaism. And I think that's
it's Shin, actually. It's the letter Shin. So you're looking at if you know, you can hear him explain it. But yeah,
I get the sound off.
Women were upstairs. 5 or 6 guys get up on the bima on the stage, and they're facing the congregation. They get their talit over their heads. And they start this chanting. I think it's called dukkening. And my father said to me, "Don't look." So everybody's got their eyes covered with their hands, or they've got their talit down over their faces, or turned away, turn their back to these guys. And I hear this strange sound coming from them. They're not singers. They were shouters. And dissonant. It was all discordant. And they were doing like that kind of wailing, and all discordant, not together, not in unison. And then the leader would shout out, "Yevarechecho," and the rest of them would respond, "Yevarechecho." It was chilling. You know? Whoa. Something major is happening here. So I peeked, and I saw them with their hands stuck out from beneath their talit like this towards the congregation.
Okay.
Wow. One day we're making the Star Trek series television series.
Yeah.
Is that how he peaked? Was he did he pull one of these?
Right.
That's how
Danny in The Shining.
Most 13-year-old boys. But it's interesting. I had thought that he had seen the women do it. He just cleared up that it was the rabbis.
You know why you might be thinking that? Because he did that book Shekhinah.
Yeah.
And of photography. It's beautiful photography. You know, people make fun of him, but I'm like, that's really sweet. He made a good book. He's like, he understands the significance of that, because Shekhinah, like, people will relate to it now. Like I'll hear discourse around it by like modern rabbis, and their treatment of it is very much that, you know, they relate to it like soil, and then you're like, and we have the seed, and then this is the soil, and this whole thing, and I'm like, that's a materialist view, like of what Shekhinah really is, because she's space. And so and that's the thing about Ein Sof too, is like Ein Sof is feminine, it's like your mother. And it's like that's why the whole tree in a sense is like the mother. But then then you have these polarities that exist with the Sephiroth, and then we basically from the left project these dualities on top of that, and then we got to deal with the consequences of that, because it's imbued into everything that we build, including all of our political structures. We always have this implicit duality in it.
That is why, actually, because the Shekinah was like, it's associated with the feminine, and the Kohinots were supposed to do it up until Josiah, right? And then Josiah kills all of the other Jewish tribes, priests and priestesses, and like rapes and burns their bones on the altars, right? So that the women can't do their work anymore. And, again, associated with the Asherah thing. But it's interesting because of Chokmah, right? Because we think of wisdom, or Sophia, right, as wisdom, philosophy.
Right. It's a different use of wisdom, because Chokhmah is masculine and Bina is feminine. But there's like, it's a template.
Why is it masculine? Is it just because of Ben Shapiro's little prayer, or is it like always masculine?
Well, that's the nature of the pillars.
Is there a masculine wisdom? I'm curious.
Well, she's the ocean. Like if you look at like the Terra Arcana and you see where like the high priestess lands, like that's the G, that's Gimel. And so, if you look behind her, you'll see that there's an ocean, and then you'll see a river that runs through the different 22 major arcana that correspond to the 22 Hebrew letters, which correspond to the 22 pathways that are arranged in the Kabbalistic tree of life. And so, and you'll see it like it's right afterwards with the Empress. There's that river behind, and the idea is that it's speaking to the Shefa. It's the emanated flow that's running through all organic existence. There you go. That's the pathway that's described in the Sefer Yetzirah. It's twisting, but when we represent that visually, like it can't be overemphasized that like this wasn't done. Like this was all something that we visualized in our minds. Like this didn't happen until the Middle Ages, that they started giving this like a drawing this thing out, because this is literally like twisting in space in its own specific formations. So it's got dynamics that are it's like if you were to show like a star tetrahedron versus a hexagram, that's at least a start, but it's still depictions. And like we were saying, like the description is not the described. Like even if you're talking about this archetypal realm, it's like if God forbid you're going to be talking about like the Godhead in that way, that you can give it an expression. Like I'd like to think that that's what they're doing with Muhammad, like where you're not supposed to represent Muhammad in any way, because it's they're like, don't like put a projected on anything. Like I get the idea of that.
It's so new, because like what you were saying before about like it's not that you shouldn't, it's just that you can't.
Right.
But like Islam is still so new that they haven't like evolved to the point where it's like, no, you can, but you can't. Like you're allowed to, but it's pointless. Like that's the real. I feel the same way about Freemasonry, but also in Freemasonry, and like if we're talking 19th century, maybe some of those things did result in death. But if we're talking 20th century, now it's like, oh well, you can't divulge the secrets because the secrets can't be divulged.
Right, and which implies that they're open secrets. I mean, it implies that they're already there for the taking. Like no person can really guard us from those secrets, because knowledge in that sense is not something that you're accumulating or compiling. You know what I mean? Like storing up a storehouse of knowledge. Like it doesn't really work that way. Like because it's innate. Like Plato said, like all real knowledge is innate. You already have it in the first place. And we really that's the thing about compartmentalization that comes with development, is we're localizing ourselves in space, and we have to put everything in its proper, we have to sort it out. And there's tension that's produced in that. And that's a lot of our neuroticism, I think, that Freud was speaking to. The big thing that Freud took from Zohar was basically repression and sublimation. And that's like every single psychoanalyst is still going to incorporate that. So Freud would go on tangents, big time, but like that at its core, that idea of like that you repress and like, Jung's notion of the shadow, like I don't see that as that distinct from what Freud himself was saying. Like that doesn't feel like he called it that. He coined it that way. It's like he coined synchronicity. as in a causal principle, but like the thing in itself, like the difference is that Freud was just such a pessimist, because I think he felt like the more layers that you take off of this onion, it's just like it keeps going. Like he didn't see an end in sight, and I think it's because he didn't get the idea of transmutation, that something can literally transform, like into that it's still the thing that's there. Like I was saying about like the pain body, like that is actually your life energy. Like it's not the problem, it's just what we're doing with that. Like I don't believe in separate energies.
Throw in the gear a little bit, or at least get your guys' take on this, because Jung also introduced or repopularized the concept of a toxin X, which was like an actual chemical or something in like a material fact inside the body that would produce people that have like dementia or delirium or like all sorts of like these neuroses. And it wasn't just shadow work 100% that you could reintegrate. And this concept of a toxin X kind of represents like almost a departure from everything is mystical, woo-woo, and Freudian.
Right, but that's melancholia too for the alchemists. So they had the same treatment, and they're saying like that basically enlightenment and like total despair. It's like there's a razor edge there, because you're like when you're at that precipice. Actually, the film Melancholia, that's what it's all about, and actually so is the album Melancholia and the Infinite Sadness, which actually syncs with Melancholia incredibly well. By the way, they're the same length. Like the full album, it's ridiculous. But yeah, no, the point being is, so if you could pull up Melancholia 1 maybe, because it's so freaking cool, and he and Albrecht Dürer invented his own like magic square in that incorporates like the year it was done. So yeah, if you see that image there, so there's a bat in it, like that there's all the world is a vampire. Like if you watch Melancholia, like all these people played vampires. So like and they're all sitting at the table, like each and every one of them pretty much. It's like Kate Winslet like started her career with Interview with a Vampire, and then Gary Oldman played a vampire at one point, but I can't remember, it was a show I think. But then Kiefer Sutherland was the Lost Boys, and they're like, it's tripping me out. Like there's a whole thing going on there. But anyway, yeah, this is relatable because Melancholia was actually a like what you're describing. Like I don't know if it's a chemical or it's like a
I had to pull up the exact reference. This is from an old Canadian journal magazine, but it just says that Carl Jung proposed in 1906 that a psychological mechanism of dementia praecox, like hysteria, developed in the presence of a quote poisoned brain, and postulated the existence of a toxin X, which was thought of as a nerve poison generated by conflict of emotions.
Oh, there you go.
So he was actually citing that like something out of nothing almost, right? Like just your thoughts created an actual toxin, which would then start attacking your material brain.
Like, how could Freud do that much cocaine and not think that?
This is Jung. This is Jung that popularized this.
Yeah, maybe the cocaine undermined it a little bit.
Oh,
the coke made him have really great ideas, but at a certain point, no one wanted to hear him anymore. They were just like, this guy hasn't shut up for 3 days.
Yeah, send him away to Paraguay. Chloe, your church, like you talk, it's still interesting to me, this idea of a non-Trinitarian thing, just because we're talking about the Sophia and the goddess, the mother goddess thing like that. Did they ever talk about Heavenly Mother or like bring up Sophia?
I grew up in a deeply misogynistic church. I only discovered the mother goddess very recently, and actually in the past 4 years as an archetype. It started when I actually was reading Carl Jung, and I was reimagining a relationship to Christmas because I wasn't allowed to celebrate Christmas because Christmas was pagan. And then I realized, well, wait a minute, Christmas, the cult of Mithras, if you say that comes from, it's just like the birth of light at the darkest day of the year. It's like brilliant. Of course, people would take that to like it's like an archetypal consciousness thing happening there. So there's nothing to be like. It sort of misses the point. Be like, oh, this is pagan, or oh, this is not purely of Jesus, because it's all the same, like hero's dream, sort of template, and that actually led me to feel very close to this concept of Mary, of Mother Mary. And I actually began to wear necklaces with Mother Mary on them because it was a symbol of the divine feminine. It was it was the first time I felt comfortable like identifying with that symbol because of how I was raised. And then eventually, because of my studying of Eastern wisdom traditions, And Hindu traditions where you have, Shakti and Shiva and all of, there's the feminine is there and prominent in many ways. So now I feel far more, it's just a part of my lingua franca, but growing up, it was not at all.
It's weird when you read the Bible, right? Because like it talks about her a lot, and people notice it. Like, so here they just translate it as lowercase wisdom, even though that's like Sophia. Yeah. Does she not cry and understanding put forth her voice? She standeth in the top of highest places by the way of the place of the past. She crieth at the gate, at the entry of the city, at the coming of the doors. Unto you.
What book is this?
This is Proverbs.
Proverbs.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. There's another really good one actually, which is like only in the Catholic Bible, which is the Wisdom of Solomon, the Book of Wisdom, right? So when we think of Proverbs, it's about wisdom, but there's a whole other book that's just literally supposed to be about wisdom. And
look up understanding, because that's Chokmah. So that's actually that's not. If it was Greek, it could be Sophia. But if you understanding, there you go.
Let's do a Proverbs Hebrew. What's it called? The Hebrew text analysis. That's the word.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, and then we'll go down a bit. So Chokmah is for wisdom, and then understanding.
Yes, it has them both.
Yeah.
So it would be,
So that's kind of that's almost Muslim, right?
So you see it's Vav, Tav, Beit, Vav, Nun, Hey for understanding. So it's the starting at the Beit. So the first two letters are not it. They're connected to it.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me, like this idea that there is a lot of evidence for like the divine feminine. And what do you like? Where do you see like today, like now, after you've grown up through this and now you're looking at it, like where do you see the place for the divine feminine?
What do you mean? Where do I see the place for it?
Well, you're talking about Mary. You're talking about, well, it's for everybody, right? Like I think people are latching on to either being a consumer or a human citizen, taxpayer, or like a man or a woman, right? Like those are like, what is the feminine for?
I see. So I have I mentioned earlier I had a chanting practice. So I was in this vocal chanting practice for 7 months, working with a coach who has a training rooted in Hindu, Buddhist, and Taoist teachings. It's a chanting system that's based on the chakra system. So you chant for 30 minutes every day, and each chant is associated with a different chakra. And the first chakra that you chant is the root chakra, and the root chakra is associated with the feminine, the mother, the earth, from which everything emerges. And I have found that cosmology, if you will, very both comforting and utilitarian, in the sense that the utility that I'm looking for is to become more embedded in nature itself. And so that's how it manifests for me in my own life today. I still have my Mother Mary pendants, but I don't wear them as often. Not that I wouldn't, but it isn't like calling to me right now. But this particular practice that I've been steeped in for the past few months, and will probably continue like for the rest of my life, to be honest, because there's also the vocal piece is like you're training your vagus system to calm down your like your fight or flight limbic brain, and it's giving me another way to tune in to the material in the non-egoic sense, right? The material, that fleshy material that is here, in order to actually change the way I relate to the world around me, change the way I relate to triggers and things that would otherwise cause my ego to be triggered. So I felt all of those things intersecting and still put me in a connection and a relationship with the divine feminine.
Do you all right, now to be a little Slavoj Zizek here, do you think that Do you think that your connection to the divine feminine is a bit of romanticism of the feminine archetype? It's not that it is perfect. It's the way you're thinking that it's perfect that's making it a romantic differentiation of the form. Do you think that being do you think it's a foreign like romanticism, like the way men?
I'm sure that exists in some capacity, but at the same time, you know, it like in the Eastern Wisdom traditions, the divine feminine is associated with both creation and destruction, right? It's not this like pure, I don't know, lily white sort of depiction that we have in certain European traditions.
Yeah. Let's expand on that. Like, so we think of wisdom. We think of Sophia as wisdom, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Is femininity wisdom? Like, or is
well,
like,
how are you? What are you associating with wisdom though? Because wisdom is also like inanna. I'm probably saying that word wrong, but like there is this mythology.
Is that there's chaos too, because like Eris, I think of Sophia, but I also think of Eris, and I think of the apple of discord as sort of the forbidden fruit, maybe, right? So wisdom and discord, I don't know. I don't actually have an answer for what wisdom is. Maybe
well, if we're talking about
it requires death. It presupposes death, I would say, and that's right. Like wisdom presupposes death, and actually, I think that the banishment of the divine feminine in our cosmology, there's no coincidence that we're so afraid of death, and we're so like. It's not a coincidence that so many of our imagery in New York City are skyscrapers pointing upward, depicting this need to ascend. There's a fear of descent, right? But a lot of the feminine icons, if you will, like I think it's in the tradition, the Roman tradition, but there's a particular myth of Inanna where the woman has to descend into the underworld in order to be with. And then come back with wisdom for half a year.
Yeah.
Which is also a reference to mushrooms, maybe. Just going to throw that out there.
Or Persephone.
Mycelium, it has to develop underground.
That's right,
Anyways.
Everything is mentality key. I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting, though, like that femininity can be both wisdom and chaos. And I think that that might be, there's something tied there between those two ideas.
Right, but is that the chaos that we experience? Like our association of chaos is one thing, but like the intelligence of the vastness of what we're existing inside of goes beyond like I think a lot of our concepts around what chaos is. Like if I think of chaos like just normally, I'm like, oh, like cars crashing, people screaming, and I'm like total chaos, you know, dogs and cats living together. But like, you know, but ultimately, like I think that there's something like when people talk about chaos magic, I've seen it described in a lot of different ways. Some of them I resonate with, some of them I'm like, what are you talking about? But you know, so but there's that idea of like that chokhmah as wisdom is an emergence of a template. So if you formulate a thought and then you execute in action like through that thought, even if it's just verbalizing, even if it's speaking, like the action of speaking, and it's like this is abracadabra, right? But it's like you have like, you know, for something to come into form through speech. But there's like this idea that it's like that chokhmah, the wisdom, is in that template, that initial spark of a thought. And then the actual like distribution of that idea, which is an act of creation, that is attached to Bina, which would be feminine in nature, that belongs to the feminine pillar. And the order of the upper worlds are not necessarily the same as what we understand in the lower worlds. You know, it's like we'd be like dogs looking at humans playing chess or something. It's just like that is it has its own, you know, its own.
That's the tetragrammaton, because you have the absolute masculine, the absolute feminine, the masculine in reference to the feminine, and the feminine in reference to the masculine, right? So they exist as separate, but they only exist as in relation to each other at the same time.
Right, which is why like synchronicity as a causal principle, that's maybe the wrong way to put it, because it's just a causal as far as we're concerned, because we can't pinpoint the cause because we have our own framework that we're relating to. Right. And so like synchronicity, the idea is it's like the hand of God like coming in to our chaos or whatever it is that we've built up for ourselves. And it's like when we see an order there where we wouldn't expect to see an order, because we see order everywhere in nature, but in our goings on, you don't expect to find it there. But it does exist there because we're distinct, but we're not separate from that intelligence, you know?
New York City, right? I mean, New York City is a great example because it's like constantly got chaotic elements, but it is a flow, right? It's something that can turn.
Yeah. You know what, Chloe, you would really like sadomasochism, I think. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
So we had a guest on, Nina Paley, and she made a film called Sadomasochism. And yeah, this is one scene in it. But yeah, she's brilliant. But she has like a kind of a thesis, like a very creative thesis that she was kind of like just intuiting. So like in this story, it's a story. She's talking with her father, who basically plays God, and she's got these recordings of her with her dad, and her own experience is being very detached from Judaism, even though she was Jewish. But they would do Passover, you know. So she's trying to understand it, and so like she made this film of her own process with her dad's understanding of Judaism. But she goes to this place where she's kind of like, she's relating to this idea that there was like the most ancient expression of the religion actually was feminine in nature. You know, like, I mean, I would point out that Kabbalah literally means to receive, and I would say receptivity is a very feminine quality, right? And so so she kind of like has this idea of like how this most sacred thing kind of became the stone that the builders rejected, you know, and how it's there in the midst, and it's inevitable for it to be put to its rightful place, but we have to endure this interim.
I like that. I'm definitely going to watch this.
It's really interesting to me how she also associates like her own symbol in this movie. I'm trying to find the picture of it. Is she plays like a goat, like the scapegoat kind of an idea.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But that's important because we, you know, a lot of people associate the goat like with evil. They're like sheep and the goat, you know, and the Christians are sheep, and like you want to be sheep, I guess that's what people want. Yeah. But if you look at like Azazel and the idea of like the scapegoat, and that there's like Christ is one goat, and like Emmanuel's one goat, and the scapegoat for the devil, like there's a goat for each, right? And they're casting lots on it. I find that interesting, the idea of the scapegoat, because we look at that as evil for some reason. Well, we're about done here. Is there anything that you want to make sure we cover? Like, I feel like we could have asked you what you wanted to talk about, but we mansplained.
Well, this is fun.
About.
If anyone wants to follow me, they can do so on the socials at Valdary on Twitter and Instagram. And also, if you want to bring a dope inclusion and belonging training to your workplace, check out Theory of Enchantment. It's my day job, and I'm enjoying trying to crack the code of teaching people how to love one another.
There's a few more minutes in that. Maybe you want to just like explain why the Theory of Enchantment is a solution.
The Theory of Enchantment is a solution because we teach people how to basically do shadow work, how to get in the right relationship with themselves so they don't project their insecurities onto others. And the idea is that once they start to open up to the awesomeness of their being as human beings, who are this spectacular, just like miraculous beings full of infinite complexity, if we can fall in love with that and apprehend that, we will be able to apprehend that in the other, and we'll be less likely to respond to conflict in mimetic, scapegoaty ways, and more likely to respond in a way that's like problem solving and holistic, essentially.
Next time I'll make you talk about Palestine in the Middle East, but we got through a 2 hour. Okay.
I'd love to come back on and talk about that. Let's do it. I'm down.
Very good. Let me also show you where you can get some of their work, because David teased earlier, but he does some pretty cool stuff, actually. If you go to his MK Ultrasound, you know, like MK Ultrasound, he does synchro-mysticism. Have you ever seen like where they put Pink Floyd with Dark Side of the Moon, or with Wizard of Oz or something like that? You watch the Wizard of Oz and you listen to Pink Floyd with it. There's a lot of movies where the soundtrack is, you know, they had to pay for one soundtrack, but secretly, man, if you listen to another record while you watch that movie, it's like it plays 3 times perfectly or something like that. And there's just a lot of excuses for why this would happen, like maybe just naturally, or also, again, you can't afford that record, or there's 2 simultaneous projects. You're working for one company and your friend's working for another company. He's the record producer for Sony and you're like the Disney editor. But there's some, or maybe you're an artist, right? And you made your album around a movie. But there's just so many great examples, and David's done an amazing job explaining and putting together why these movies are synchronized with certain music. It also, I feel like movies are designed to hide things from you, and music is such a great way to hide things from you. So if you change the soundtrack, you end up seeing things in the movie that are far more like, I guess, Kubrickian, the idea that there are hidden symbols in that movie, like H.G. Wells or something like that, or Orson Welles. But yeah, I don't know, David, you should say that all again for yourself.
Oh, you're great. I appreciate that, Andreas. You have an understanding of what I do, and you're able to articulate it. I just see that Will Morgan just said yo in the chats, which is I'm going to continue on from here. We're going to do Meta Egg tonight, I think, for at least an hour.
What episode are you going to cover tonight?
Well, last time we did Rosemary's Baby with the White Album, and so this time we're staying on a similar tangent, but it's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood with Lana Del Rey's Norman fucking Rockwell.
Oh, wow.
So it's on a trajectory. Yeah.
That's epic. Yeah, so make sure you guys go to MK Ultrasound so you can follow him. And if you click on highlights, you've got all of his sync work. There's hundreds of movies here that are synchronized together, and it's a great place to start if you're like just looking for some synchromysticism. A lot of the time they'll start out with like an intro that like explains what's going on from some perspective, right? Like Jodorowsky's film Rainbow Thief with Designer, right? And you got this intro here.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I do that for context, but it's kind of like inspired by the Kubrick quote where he's like the least effective and least enjoyable way to explain something is directly. It only goes about half an inch, but if you can get people to the point where they have to think a second of what it is that you're getting at, the thrill of discovery cuts to the heart. So I like people to figure out things for themselves. So something might seem vague, but everything that I have before certain sync films, it's there for a reason, you know. Something will be communicated there that's applicable. So there's often a backstory too. So.
It's also very social. I would recommend, like, if you're ever going to like a workshop or you're with a bunch of people, just go turn it on like the TV and walk away, and let people like be like, "What is that?" Go to paranoidamerican.com so you can check out Thomas's conspiracy theory comic book.
Oh, and speaking in my latest, if you keep scrolling down there, you'll see a link to Never a Straight Answer comic.
Oh, that's right.
Which is the Stanley Kubrick one, which I've been working on for over 5 years now. It's going to come out as soon as I'm allowed to launch it. Apparently, I can't launch it until I fulfill my adult comic that just wrapped up last month. So once I get those shipped out this month, I'll be able to launch this one.
Illuminati confirmed. Yeah, but if you have kids that are kids these days, they need to grow up knowing the truth about the moon landing. So.
And I've been burying the lead on this one too. There's a B plot in this one-shot anthology that focuses exclusively on Stanley Kubrick's telepathic cat named Polly, which a lot of people are not familiar with. So did you know that Stanley Kubrick may or may not have been able to claim credit for the first invention of a breakaway collar because he apparently had these obsessive dreams where he imagined his cat getting caught on a fence and strangling to death.
Really?
So he would like keep him up at night. So he actually invented his own version of a breakaway collar before they were mass produced and available to the public.
That's wild, considering the connection of like Basset and cats and to synchromysticism. Okay, I'm excited.
I gotta go, you guys. It's 11 p.m. here, but this was fun.
I'm closing it. I'm closing down. Thank you for being here. We'll see you next time. Peace out.
Thanks for having me. Bye.